the brief introduction. Now the main challenge is I'm coming after three good teachers. Okay, one was Ashok by himself, Harish and Prakash, and you would have got a numerical flavor from or mostly they would have dealt with analytics. But I'm going to present which is quite tangential, is experimental. Okay, typically we will deal with the metal characterization. I will talk more about that. Some problems which we have pursued over a decade here at IIT Hyderabad, and if you have any questions, always you can stop me. So it's mostly, I have said, material characterization. So we will try to. I will stick with metals. Maybe if time permits, I will talk about composites. So that's the plan, and I will. I think it's. Is it visible?
Yes, it is visible. You can slide once just to check if it is.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is good. Yeah, it is fine. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. So I have titled it as material characterization, both in terms of non-linear and linear. It doesn't matter. So I'm going to present the work carried out by both of my students. Sarnath was a master's student. So he was the first person to work with me in the area of well zone characterization. And co-guide was Dr. Abhay Kumar. And Naresh is my PhD student, currently has graduated. So he, at his master's, he worked on the high temperature metal characterization. So both these facets, I'm going to discuss it today. So this is how I have planned. I'm sorry, I have to break in between because of some urgent meetings. Then we will kickstart at 10:45. So I will just go until 10:15. Some of you might stop me, okay, at 10:15. Okay. So this is what I have planned: introduction to constitutive relation, uniaxial testing, then a brief introduction to DIC technique. Then how do you carry out material testing at high temperatures? And in case of weld joints, how do you get the localized properties within the weld zone? Then I will try to close it with a few remarks. Before I start the topic, I will just give you a brief introduction about our lab. So we have established Engineering Optics Lab in the year 2011, and we have various facilities. I mostly work on optics-based techniques, or you can call it experimental stress analysis. I use both transmission as well as reflection photoelasticity for all my fracture studies. And we have a very good 2D and 3D digital image correlation system along with the loading machine. We have two machines. One is of 250 kilonewton capacity. Another is of 100 kilonewton capacity. Both are fatigue servo-hydraulic machines. And so that's what I've said. A lot of fundamental fracture problems we work with photoelasticity. I use digital photoelasticity. That is my area of expertise. I did PhD in this area. Then we use a lot of reflection photoelasticity for actual strain measurements in field. We have carried out a couple of maybe one project with the Indian Air Force. Measurement of the strain over the landing gears. So we are able to use this technique. And for most of my composite studies, I use digital image correlation. The image on the right hand side bottom, you can see it's a plate with a hole with a composite laminate. I'm subjecting it to tensile load. And this is the longitudinal strain pattern, the loading direction. I get the contours. And I use these contours and interpret them for various damage assessments. And in 2013, we established a material characterization lab. So where all these fatigue machines are there. And then maybe in the, subsequently 2014, we established high temperature characterization. We got a project from AERB and GTRE to work at high temperatures. And we also have a TSA system, thermoelastic stress analysis, infrared NDT. So we use a lot for composites application. And currently, this system is with Dr. Gangadharan. It belongs to NDT lab. And since we are in the composites business, we have established good fabrication facilities. We have a resin transfer mold system. Then we have a vacuum bagging, resin infusion, as well as of late we have purchased both hot press as well as autoclave systems. So hot press is working, 30-ton hot press is there. So where we can put the pre-peg material and we can apply pressure and we can do carry out an accelerated curing process to get good laminates, flat laminates. And autoclave is partially installed. Hope so after this COVID times, it would start working. So this is a B background. So when I say constitutive relation, so so slightly we are changing it to more towards the stress analysis. So your stress is a second order tensor, strain is a second order tensor. They are connected by this stress and strain relationship. You can connect it using a constitutive matrix, CIJKL, and this is a fourth order tensor. And the classical example it would be an orthotropic material, which is a composite laminate. Okay, there your stress and the strain at the material level coordinate system, they are connected using 9 constants. So this is a special case. In case of an orthotropic matrix, you have materials, you have 3 mutually perpendicular planes of metal symmetry. So hence we end up with 9 constants to connect stress and strain. And in case of an isotropic material, we only need 2 constants. That you can see that in the constitutive matrix. So I'm sorry for this notation. Earlier I used to see this is D. Both are same. So D11 and D12. These are the 2 constants which connect stress and strain. And D is a function of E and nu. And the bottom expression you can see this is a 3-dimensional Hooke's law connecting stress and strain. And the biggest advantage you have with isotropic material is your normal stress is connected to normal strain, and your shear stress is connected to shear strain. So there is no coupling between normal and shear. That is the biggest advantage you have. That is why this material is, in terms of complexity, it is at the lowest level. And thankfully, most of our day-to-day applications, materials for day-to-day applications are isotropic by nature. Whereas if you look at the orthotropic material, so there is going to be coupling between the normal and the shear. In this case, because you are locally defined it to the metal coordinate system, but when I'm going to define it globally, then you will see that the coupling would come into the picture. So that is why the complexity increases. So if you look at traditionally, always we say mechanics catches up with the materials. Okay, so materials people innovate new materials, okay, metal scientists, and then mechanics catches up with it because the complexity involved with the behavior is tremendous, and so always mechanics is left behind. So the simplest among the block is isotropic. So I will just explain you how do you characterize isotropic material. Before that, I would like to just brush up what is a stress strain behavior for a mild steel sample. Most of you would be conversant with this. Okay, so you have an elastic range, then you have plastic range. So in case for mild steel, you have a pronounced. If you look at so you have a pronounced yielding behavior. So this is like an yielding phenomenon, and then you have a hardening phase. Okay, and so this is what the typical behavior is. And if you closely observe this stress strain curve, and if I go beyond yield and then I unload, you can see that this is the unloading curve. And finally, for a zero load, there is a permanent set of deformation which has crept in. Okay, and then I start loading it again, so it starts from the same location, and then you could see that there is a slight increase in the yield value because of the hardening effect. And but another this is an advantage considering you have a increase in the yield, but the disadvantage is you lose the ductility. Okay, so your ductility has gone down. So in case of impact applications, especially for automobiles, it is not advisable. So because when your ductility is going down, your fracture toughness also will go down. Okay. And if you go beyond yield and then I unload it, then I load it, you can see that still your yield value has increased, but your ductility again has tremendously gone down. And you can see more or less it is behaving like a brittle material. Okay, there is nothing like an yielding phenomenon there. It behaves like more like a brittle material. So this is the problem of strain hardening. So of course, we want to increase the yield strength by strain hardening. Your ductility always will go down, but people do trade off. And there are some applications where people extract this phenomenon, use this phenomenon to increase the yield strength. Okay, and the image on the right hand side, you can see I've kept a sample and then I've attached an extensometer. Most of you would have carried out this test at a lab level. So extensometer comes with different gauge length. Here we have used a 25 mm gauge length extensometer. So we sort of attach it to the specimen and then we record the strains and we plot the stress versus strain. And that's how you generate this curve. So this is a typical setup involving DIC. I will explain what is DIC later. But we use DIC is an optics-based technique. Okay, we use cameras to record the images, and then subsequently we post-process it to extract the displacements and the strains. And sometimes when I use an optical technique, we have to make sure whatever the values it throws out, it has to be correct. So at the rear, we bond strain gauges to the specimen. And then we correlate these strain values with whatever is predicted by the DIC. So this is the typical dog bone specimen. You can see that this is how you fix an extensometer and record the strain. So here I think it's not 25 mm. We have used a 20 mm gauge length. Okay, and this is when I say traveling range, this is -2 to +4 mm. So 4 mm in the tensile this thing and -2 mm in the compression. And what we do is we try to when we use extensometers, most of you would have done that. So we cannot use extensometer for the entire deformation range because as it travels only -2 to +4 mm. And there is also a strain level prescribed, so it can be plus or minus 10 mm. Then the problem is you cannot use it over the entire range. So what we have to prescribe is the removal point. We say 0.7% strain or 0.25% strain or 0.5%. It depends on the different materials. Aluminium is brittle, or say quasi-brittle, you can say. Mild steel is ductile, composites is fully brittle. So we prescribe those removal range and we remove the extensometer. After that, your LVDT sensor in the machine takes over and it records the displacement, and and then it computes the strain. Then the curve continues. So if you look at basic material characterization, it is ASTM E08 standard so there they have come out with the dimensions. So the point is you have to maintain the proportionality, okay, and the gauge length, the overall length, the gripping length. All these things are very important. Even this thickness, the width of the specimen also matters. So in this example, we have taken a specimen of this dimension. We typically use wire EDM to cut the specimen. And when I talk about mild steel, so most of you would have worked with mild steel. So roughly Young's model is around 200 to 210 for structural steel, 210 GPa. And so what we do is we take the data points before yielding the proportional limit, and then we fit a curve, and you can see that, and then we extract the slope value that turns out to be the Young's modulus. And with an extensometer, you cannot get the Poisson's ratio to understand. So you have to always bond a strain gauge at the rear. You can put 2-element Rosette, one in the 0 degree, 090, you can say, 2-element Rosette. One transverse. So both the strains you have to record, and then you can plot that ratio, minus of that ratio, then you will get the Poisson's value. So that also we have done. Here only you can measure the Young's modulus with the extensometer. And you can see that this is the full stress strain curve for a mild steel. So this is the yielding phenomenon. Okay, and this is the initial portion, and you can see that this is the fracture location. And where we remove the extensometer is that location. And then you will see a small kink there. Okay, it's not reflecting here, and then because you just manually remove the extensometer, and then your curve starts to locate. That's occasion, and that continues. So this is based on the extension of the actuator. So this is the basic process for any isotropic material to begin with. So you get the yield. Yield is 240 MPa. Ultimate is around 330, and elongation is greater than, because the mild steel expected 25.3, and the percentage reduction is 47. So when we write a report, this is how you have to put the values: percentage of elongation, percentage of reduction in the cross section. And also you have to mention the temperature at which you have carried out the study, and the grade of the material also what you have tested.
Can I ask one question, Rahul?
Yes, please go ahead.
So like the plot that you are having is stress versus true strain of the material, right?
Yes.
And let us say
it's not true. True will go up. It's an engineering stress. Engineering stress.
Okay.
So true will go like this. It will not come down.
Right. Okay. Thanks.
Okay. The engineering stress versus engineering stress. Yeah, any other questions from the audience? So this is for an aluminium. So we have done the characterization for AL2014T6. So this is what the specimen dimensions are, and we have employed both DIC as well as this is from the extensometer. When I say MTS, it is from the extensometer. Okay, so you can see typical aluminum behavior is this. This is a 2 series alloy. T6 is a tempering condition. You don't see a pronounced yielding phenomenon. So we call it as it's a quasi brittle by nature, and so this is what the Poisson's ratio you got. So it's something like close to 0.35. You can see that. So typically what we do is we plot epsilon YY versus epsilon XX. So this is what we do, and then we fit a linear line, and then we get the values. So this is, so you can see a marked difference between a mild steel and an aluminum. Aluminum is quasi brittle. Okay, even though it's a metal, it's a quasi brittle. So yeah, 1 second. Ashok, your so this is conventional thing. Most of you would have know it. So now we'll look at the digital image correlation. The technique we extensively use nowadays in the field of experimental stress analysis. Okay. So this was proposed by Professor Sutton from North Carolina in the year 1983, if I'm right. So it's an innovative whole field non-contact optical technique used for measuring surface displacement and strain. So the biggest advantage of digital image correlation is you have a background on optics. Prior to DIC, maybe during 80s, parallelly another technique came into the picture known as ESPI, electronic shear pattern interferometry. Okay. So what they do is any metal surface, if you sort of illuminate it with a laser, right, then you will see a rough surface. So this we call it as the natural speckles. But what Professor Sutton did was he created an artificial speckle pattern on the specimen, and then he used that speckle deformation to extract the stress, extract the strain as well as the displacement. So how did he extract was he employed a technique called pattern matching algorithm. Okay, so pattern matching is not a very new. Maybe the 80s you can still people that your face recognition or your thumb prints, isn't it? So what do they do is when you take an image of a thumb, typically it is split into small windows, and they sort of extract the intensity values corresponding to each window. It can be an histogram, it can be an average intensity value. So any particular thumb will have, depending on the feature. So those internal characteristics won't change. So next time when you put, see, the algorithm searches for those features, okay, and then it matches it, and if there is a strong correlation, then it assumes that it's the same thumb which has been put, and then it gives us the access. So this is how the pattern matching algorithm started. Okay, so the same algorithms have been borrowed, and then people have used it. So I will explain it in the subsequent slide. How do we carry out DIC measurement? The big advantage you have is a simple surface preparation. Okay, simpler optics, and another greatest advantage is any class of material could be studied, and you get a whole field strain or the displacement over the specimen surface, and it can be successfully applied to both small and large deformation problems. So the why we put in case of a conventional extensometry, the disadvantage is it is a point measurement. You have to understand, okay, or over a gauge length it measures. You don't get a complete picture about the field. So even though it measures longitudinal strain, the extensometer, but it is over a gauge length. You have to understand. And the second thing is you have different extensometers for different elongation levels. Okay, you don't have one unique extensometer for different elongation levels. Okay, which can accommodate all the elongations. Okay, all the I would say the complete spectrum of the range. Okay, you have variable extensometers. I can generate variable gauge lengths and I can use it, but the problem is it's very cumbersome. So that is why this technique has scored over, and it also gives us the displacement. Traditionally, people used LVDT, and that also is a point-wise measurement, and strain gauge also, it's a point-wise measurement. So that is where the DIC really scored over the conventional strain gauges of the extensometer. So this is what the basic principle is all about. You have a window. Okay, that window upon deformations gets displaced by some amount in X and the Y direction, and you track that window with the loading. And if I know the center of that window, then I can subsequently get the U and the V displacement along the X and the Y direction. And then I can also get the strains. So this is how basically the DIC works. So what we do is we take a sample and we put a white paint on top of it. Then we introduce this artificial speckle pattern. We call it black dot. So this is how the surface would look like. And then we select a region of interest, and within that region of interest, the algorithm divides it into sub windows or subsets, we call it as, and we track these subsets or sub windows with the loading time. So for tracking it, what we do is we use a strong correlation principles. Okay, so typically when I take an image, when I use a monochrome camera, then it's a grayscale image. So you have a pure black would be 0 intensity, and pure white would be whatever depends on the I would say the bandwidth. Suppose if I say it's an 8-bit camera, so 2 power 8 gray levels are possible. So 0 to 255 would be the grayscale variation. So 255 would be white and 0 would be black. Okay, there are like 2 power 16, 2 power 32. So these are the bit levels. Okay, so higher the bit levels, costlier the camera would be, And but you can even so your gradations would be very fine. Okay, theoretically our eyes has got a infinite gradation. You can even pick the smallest of the grayscale change. Okay, but in case of camera, it depends on the bit level: 2 power 8, 2 power 60, 2 power 32. Right. So when I record these images, it's in the grayscale. So always it is an intensity information, and every window has got a unique intensity property, and then we use that intensity value for sort of a for the correlation phenomenon. And then if it's a perfect correlation comes in, then we know that this is exactly the same window, and that's how you track the sub windows. This is the basic setup. You have a loading frame. You have a specimen, and then you have cameras, and depends on the configuration. So this is a 3D means. So you get both in-plane strains and in-plane displacements, as well as out-of-plane displacement. Fine. So this is your 3D DIC setup where we have 2 cameras. So we use 2 cameras to get the depth information. And upon loading, what we do is we acquire images right from 0th loading, and always you compare with the 0th loading, and you estimate what are your displacements and the strain levels are. Okay, the biggest challenge is you have to synchronize the loading as well as the image acquisition, because whatever the image I acquire, I should know what the load value is. Otherwise, I cannot interpret those images. So you have to synchronize both the operations. And it's fairly simpler experiment to do. Maybe so we have a simpler optics also. We have a light source. You can see that these are the light sources. So light impinges on the model, it gets reflected back to the camera, and then we record the images. So we use a commercial system which we have purchased it from even Saturn's group only. It is called correlated solution. So we have a big 3D system. We also have a big 2D system. So we use the commercial systems for such our studies. And another big challenge is all is not rosy in case of DIC. Okay, so people have shown it. DIC is very good for if you have such kind of studies like tensile testing or any flat laminate being loaded, okay, or simple bending. Okay, so but if you have a curved object, then DIC has got its own problem. So you have to understand for curved object like a shell, then we need to be careful. Okay, so your zone of interest or region of interest would be very small. Okay, and then that is where still lot of currently people are looking at that how to solve when you have a curvature and we are loading it, so that we can get a reliable estimate out of it. So you should not come to a conclusion that DIC would replace strain gauge. It's not possible. The strain gauge has got its own advantage. Even up to 1 micro epsilon, you will get an accurate value strain readings. But in DIC depends on being optical based approach. Maybe you cannot get an accuracy close to 1 micro epsilon. Maybe it can be close to 30 micro epsilon. You can get an accurate value. So, okay, because it's an optic based technique, you have to understand. So it has got its own limitations. So the image on the right hand side, you can see that we have taken a simple uniaxial test specimen. We have gripped it at the left end here, and then we have applied a tensile load. So this is a zero load image, and this is after application of load. We have grabbed it. With normal eye, it's quite impossible to distinguish this deformation. So then we have written our own, we have developed our own 2D DIC code. Okay, this code was developed by Anup Tejo Matthew. He was a BTech student, did a honors project with me, and he developed this in MATLAB. And you can see that it is 0 there, and wherever you're applying the load, it's a maximum. So this is how you get the whole field displacement. So beyond using DIC, we are also interested in developing DIC because there are a lot of complexities involved in measurements, and so we should evolve our own algorithms to circumvent those problems and improve the accuracy of it, especially when you come to fracture mechanics, or when you come to foams, or when you come to holes. Okay, there the prediction or the accuracy of the algorithms, and always there is scope for improvement. Okay, so this is a 2D DIC. 2D DIC is pretty easy. You have only one camera. You always make sure that camera is kept perpendicular to the specimen, and then you apply the light source. Okay, you have the light, and then you load the specimen, and you record the images in sync with the load cell. Right. So this is a brief introduction. So if you want to get understand more about DIC, there is a website called NCOR, NCORR. Okay, so that's a free MATLAB-based software developed by some few students at Georgia Tech, US. Okay, that's a 2D DIC code. It's freely available, but you need MATLAB to run it. And so you can, if you go through that manual, you will understand how the DIC works, okay, how to load images, and then you'll get more details. And if you want to still explore more about DIC, there is a book by Strider and Sutton, Digital Image Correlation. It's a Springer-Verlag textbook. You can buy it and you can read it. Okay. Now, so far we have looked at conventional and possible. Yes, Ashok?
No, somebody looks like an unmuted the mic. I'll check it. You continue.
Yeah. So now we will look at the high temperature. What happens? What are the challenges? Okay, because if you go to power plant industries today, even it can be a boiler application, even it can be a turbine application. You go to aircraft industry, okay, especially engines, or you go to electronic packaging, okay, where you have solder bumps and you have the packaging material, and then you on top of it you have the chip, so they are bonded. And these solder bumps are subjected to high cycle fatigue, thermofatigue loads. Okay, so even the smaller scale to the higher scale, you need to conduct experiments at higher temperatures. And getting properties at higher temperatures is a bit of challenge because once you move into the high temperature and there is an fatigue, and then prolonged exposure to temperature also the creep, so fatigue creep interactions. How do you characterize the material at for those kind of interactions? Okay, so there is a lot of scope in that direction. So I thought the real challenges where DIC comes in handy, and what sort of issues we have faced, and where still there is a lot of scope for us to improve upon. The same aluminum material we have taken it, and we have so this is what happens is moment you go to high temperature, I cannot hold it in the grip, and we can't test it. Okay, so we have to put a furnace, localized heating we have to give. So what we have done is we have given a Clevis pin kind of an arrangement. Okay, so this we have used A8M11 standard. And so it's a thin specimen, okay, and so we are fabricated using EDM, and prior to the experiment, the challenge was we have to ensure that because these speckle patterns, whatever we are introducing, they don't peel off under high temperature ambience conditions. Okay, that is very important. So there are special planes available. We have used Ultralux thermo coating paint. We got it from Germany, and So this can withstand up to 1000 degrees C. It doesn't peel off that easily. Okay. And we also have purchased high temperature backplanes. So it's the paint is not that costly, but the shipping it from abroad is very costly because it is I would say corrosive. So special care needs to be taken, and the freight charges are very, very high. Okay. Sadly, we don't get these high temperature paints in our country. So this is what this is how the speckle pattern we apply, and we at the center of the specimen we can fix the region of interest, and then we can study. So yeah, just look at the time.
It's 10. 9:59.
Okay, Ashok, if it's okay,
Yeah,
you can stop me at
yeah.
10:15, Ashok. Yeah.
Yes, sure.
Thank you. So we designed a furnace. Okay, we had an MTS system. We designed a furnace, and furnace from it's also very costly. Okay, when you get it done for testing, when you get it from the MTS kind of a system. So this is what we designed. So we had this the pull rod. We call this one of the pull rod, the green color one you can see. This is the pull rod. So this is your bolt is bolted to the grips, not the grip, the heads, the fixed and the moving heads. And then this is the clevis pin arrangement. So this is your specimen. Okay, so the temperature, max temperature, you can go up to is 1000 degrees C, and we put a small weaving window of size 100 mm by 100 mm for a DIC measurement, because we because we have to send the light, and it has to come back, and we have to record the images. So the challenge was this window. Okay, so we use a special glass for it. It was a custom built. So this is typically the arrangement. You can see once you open the back half of the furnace, so this is your pull rod, this is your fixture, and this is a water cooled grip. You can see that it's a water cooled grip. And then and this is your extensometer, high temperature extensometer. This we procured from Epsilon. Okay, it can go up to 1200 degrees C. This is aluminum, I think aluminum oxide rods, aluminum carbide rods. I don't remember. It is a 25 mm gauge length and 50 mm extension plus not 50 mm. Yeah, plus 50 and plus 50 percent strain it can measure in the positive direction, and minus 10% strain it can measure in the compression direction. So at the side we insert it, and then we make sure that it touches the specimen. And so this is the weaving window we had. Okay. And this is the entire test setup. You can see light source. These are this is the light source, and then you have a camera here. So we stay away from furnace, and we use a special zoom lens, called Tamron lens. It's a macroscopic zoom lens. Okay. So we put it at a distance, and then we focus on this window, and then so you can see that this is how you get the. This is the U displacement, the transverse direction. This is the V displacement. And this is your transverse strain, and this is your longitudinal strain. And these are your ceramic rods. You can see that. Okay, so what we can do is ceramic rods we employ because we want to sort of correlate the DIC measurements. Okay. All these studies were carried out maybe 7 years back. At that time, people were exploring DIC for high temperature. Only few research groups in the world work on this direction. It has got a lot of advantages. Okay, because these extensometers are very costly, and if beyond 1200, if you go to up to 1600, then you need a water cooled arrangement for it. And then then you have to remove it at some particular location. So it's not that easy to handle the extensometer. In case of 1200 degrees Celsius, what we do is we flush pneumatic air at a very high temperature. So immediately those ceramic rods get cooled. Okay, so they don't get exposed, like they don't deform. So immediately they get cooled. We use some high pressure pneumatic system to sort of cool it. So this is at the first one is the room temperature 73.3. Exactly is what the previous curve I have shown. So yield is around 439.4, and then this is all with conventional extensometer. Okay, so we did estimates at 100, 200, 300, and the 400. I am not showing you the full curve. So this is to get the Young's modulus and the yield. Okay, and you can see that as the temperature goes up, your yield strength is coming down, and as well as your Young's modulus is coming down. Okay, and at 400 degrees C, you can see that there's a tremendous reduction in the almost it has halved in terms of Young's modulus, and your yield is around 125 megapascal. So this is what the temperature does to the material. And if you look at maybe this we were also very new at that time, and it's a very, believe me, it's a very tough ball game to carry out high temperature studies. And the biggest challenge was what was the soaking time. So when we put it at zero load, okay, you close the furnace, and so you have to make sure that uniformly the specimen gets heated up. So we figured out with lots of trials and errors, it should be not be less than minimum 30 minutes, maximum 1 hour. So that's what we call the soaking time. So we just switch on the furnace and then wait for 30 minutes, 1 hour. And then we carry out the measurements. And this Clevis grip arrangement is very interesting because it is a self-alignment grip. Because even small deformations are there because of this, because you are starting from 25 to whatever the set temperature is going to be. Because of some deformations can come. So this Clevis spring arrangement is being self-alignment, it takes care of that deformation. So in that way, is most prescribed grip arrangement for the testing. But if you are working with high strength alloys, it might be difficult. So you have to look at the pneumatic grips or hydraulic grips, and even setups are available like that. But we had some problem. So this is from extensometer reading. So, but when we did some initial studies using DIC, when I tried to measure strains, these are measurements at 300 degrees C over this region. So what we do is we estimate epsilon YY over this window. We get strains over all the subsets center. Okay, and then we average it out and we plot it. Okay, so if you look at it, it has to be like uniform. Okay, but you don't see that you have a lot of undulations or oscillations. And then what we did was we looked at the literature. So what happens is because there is a window and we are carrying out a temperature test at maybe 25 degrees Celsius or 27 degrees. We always do it at a controlled ambient. We put the switch on AC and we do that. So what happens is that because there is a thermal gradient inside 100 or 200 and outside is 25. So a convective current develops in front of the window. And because we are using is an optic based technique, so then it affects the image quality. Okay, because of this convection, and then it causes the undulations. So in simplest suggestion was when you are using a furnace like this, you have to circulate the air in front of the furnace. So you have to use a forced circulation. So we have to put a fan and blow the air in front of the furnace. So that is what we have done. Another technique is you get rid of this closed furnace. People also use a coil kind of an arrangement to heat the specimens. And you do without a closed arrangement. But there the big challenge was you cannot use a white light. You have to use a specific wavelength. So commercially, people use either a green laser LED, green LED, or a blue LED for high temperature measurements. Okay, so at that time we didn't have an LED, blue or a green. So what we did was. So what we did was, so we used a simple force circulation, and you can see the bottom one, the data has improved. Okay, with that, and so this is what from the DIC we got it, and still these undulations are there. And if you look at the literature, this is how it is going to be. Okay, but there is also scope for improvement to get a smooth data, or you can also fit a data. Okay, so we have estimated it, and this is how the full stress strain curve. You can see that at various temperatures we have got it. And if you consider the MTS were DIC, yield strength, UTS, so fairly a good match is there. Okay, and even the Poisson's ratio is increasing upon increase in the temperature. So this is this is a study we have carried out for aluminum. So we have restricted it to 400 because if you look at aluminum melting point is around 660. Okay, so we are looking at just above the recrystallization temperature. So some data above recrystallization. So recrystallization, if you look at it, is Tm by 3. So 220 degrees C. So anything above 220, you will see the softening effect. So reduction in the strength, okay, increase in the elongation, reduction in the hardness. So this is because of the your older grains are getting replaced with newer grains. So this is after the recrystallization, all these phenomena are okay. So this is successfully have demonstrated we can use a non-contact extensometry for a high temperature or elevated temperature measurements. So, yeah, Ashok, I would like to take a few questions. Yeah, and any questions are there? If you have any questions, so please ask. Because this is another topic, so I would like to start after the break. Any particular questions are there?
If you want to break now, you want to break now?
Yeah, it's 10:20. Ashok, the meeting. So
okay.
It is 10:11. No? So 10:15. Because this is another topic, so I can start afresh.
Sure.
Start afresh.
Yeah. That is true.
10:45.
Okay. So we will stop it here.
Yeah.